The wondrous love of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, He'll prepare for us a place.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sign.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Let us then.
And so we're in chapter 17, which opens up, and really it's the first 7 verses are kind of blocked together, and then 8 to 16 is the second block of this chapter. All the congregation of the sons of Israel journeyed by stages from the wilderness of Sin, according to the command of the Lord, encamped at Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. Now, we actually get a little bit more information, and I'm going to switch the slide. This is just going to be a slide that sits up here and shows this map. This is the area of the world that we're reading about. This is Goshen. This is where they left. They've come down here. They've crossed the Red Sea. They're in this area somewhere. It's so small on my display, I can't tell you exactly where this city is that is mentioned. But I actually want to turn your attention very briefly. Keep your finger at Exodus 17, because I want us to understand that the by stages thing and the fact that there's no time marker, we're going to find out they actually stopped at some other places along the way. And so in Numbers 33, starting from, I guess, verse 9, it says, they journeyed from Marah and came to Elim. And in Elim, there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they camped there. We read about that a while back. They journeyed from Elim and camped by the Red Sea. And they journeyed from the Red Sea and camped in the wilderness of Sin. Now, that's where they're at with the manna. And they journeyed from the wilderness of Sin and camped at Dophkah. And they journeyed from Dophkah and camped at Alush. And they journeyed from Alush and camped at Rephidim. Now it was there that the people had no water to drink. And so what you find out is that here in Numbers, in the recounting of their history, they actually had 2 other stops along the way to Rephidim. What is going on here in Exodus is simply moving us to this next picture, this next segment. If you think about this as a television show or a movie, what you have is a bunch of scenes in movies. So you get this scene, and you get this scene, and you get this scene, and then they create segues to join those scenes together. That's all that happens in the first 2 verses here, is it's just connecting the manna scene to the scene that's focused on here in chapter 17. So it says, therefore, well, they got there and there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore, the people quarreled with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. And Moses said to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? Now, we just happened to talk about trials and tests this past weekend. How do you test the Lord? Okay. That is one aspect in which we test the Lord, test his faithfulness. Is it a good thing or a bad thing to test the Lord? Okay, a bad thing. Uh, just keep that question in your mind. Okay, and I wouldn't argue with that, but keep the question in your mind. If time allows, we'll get back to it at the end of class when we're tying some of the things that we studied tonight into the New Testament and talking about ourselves. And so he asked them, "Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water. And that's an explanatory phrase. Okay? The question is, why do you test the Lord? And the explanation is, they were thirsty. And is that not the way life is a lot of times for us? That the circumstances that we're dealing with in the flesh supersede any other consideration. In other words, what had God promised them? Yeah, in a broad sense, he had promised them deliverance from bondage and entrance into the promised land. So what could they reasonably infer from a promise that says, I'm going to deliver you out of slavery and bring you to a promised land, a land that flows with milk and honey? What can they reasonably infer from that promise? Yeah. They're not going to die in between. They can reasonably infer that they're not all going to perish. And so there's water lacking and they're thirsty, but they should know that somehow or some way that their need is going to be met, right? They should realize that because they've been promised that they're going to enter the promised land. Or going to have the opportunity to enter the promised land, maybe is a better way to put that. To look at a parallel to that, Abraham wanted or was promised a son. Son doesn't come. So his wife says, well, here's my handmaiden. He has a son with a handmaiden named Ishmael. God says, you got a promised son coming. He says, well, I got Ishmael already. Why Ishmael? Well, no, you're going to have a son with your wife. And that's the child of promise. And it's through that child that these blessings will come. So then, in his old age, when, as one passage in the Bible puts it, he was as good as dead, this child is born to him. And when the child is a young lad, God says what? You take the child, go out here, I want you to offer sacrifice, and I want Isaac to be the sacrifice. And he says, okay, and he loads everything up and heads up the mountain. When we read about those events in Hebrews chapter 11, we get some insight into the mind of Abraham that were not actually given in the Genesis account. And that is that Abraham believed that God would raise Isaac from the dead if that's what he needed to do in order to keep his promise. Okay, that is a reasonable inference from, a promise that was repeated multiple times, by the way. You're going to have a son. That son's going to come to you through Sarah. That son is going to become a great nation. So while he's yet a lad before he can have any progeny at all, he's told to kill the child. Abraham is so confident in God keeping his promise that even the most extreme thing that could be required, he believes is what would be done if that's what's necessary in order for God to fulfill his promise. In other words, he's confident that God's going to fulfill his promise. That's the opposite attitude of what these people have. These people have been promised, you are going to be brought safely out of this place and brought to another place, a land that I promised your forefathers before you. And yet every step of the way, they have seen with their eyes impediments to that promise being kept and have doubted the promise rather than said God will do what he needs to do to make it work. Started at the Red Sea. When they camp at the Red Sea and there's mountains on either side of them, the Egyptian army comes after them and they say, what, have you brought us here to die? Was there not graves in Egypt? Then God parts the sea. They get safely across the sea. He destroys the army of the Egyptians. They walk out into the wilderness and say, we're hungry. And we remember back in Egypt sitting by the meat pots and having all these vegetables to eat. And would you bring us out here to starve? And God says, here's the manna. And I'm going to send quail. And then they walk just a little bit further and they get to a place where there's no water. And they say, we're going to die of thirst. They are focused on all of the things in life, in the material world, that are impediments rather than trusting in the promises of God. And we do that same thing. We do that same thing. God has told us to go forth and sow the seed of the gospel in the hearts of men. And we see every reason in the world not to go. We say things like, oh, nobody's interested, or they're not going to respond, or they're not a good person, they're not the right prospect. We come up with every excuse in the world why it's not going to work. And then some people even then say, well, you know what? What he's asked us to do isn't going to work, but if we augment it and make some changes and offer some other things, well, that will work. All of that's the same thing. It's a failure to trust God, which is the same thing as saying it's what? It's a lack of faith. That's what faith is having confidence in what God has said. So that's what's going on here, and they're complaining about all these things. And Moses said, why do you test the Lord? And the answer is because they were thirsty. That's why. That's why they tested the Lord. That's why they challenged Moses. That's why they were grumpy. Because, by the way, we get grumpy when we're uncomfortable too. We don't get enough sleep, or we're thirsty or hungry or tired. We get grumpy. Well, so did they. They grumbled against Moses and said, why now have you brought us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? I mean, God had just supplied food miraculously for them. Could he not supply water? And yet this is what they ask. So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, by the way, that's where the children of Israel should have done. They should have cried out to the Lord and say, Lord, you've promised to provide for us. We lack this thing. We trust you. And so we wait and see how you're going to provide. Or let us know what to do. Moses cried out to the Lord, what shall I do to this people? A little more and they will stone me. Then the Lord said to Moses, pass before the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Now this is the staff that he used to turn the Nile into blood. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he named the place Massah and Meribah because of the quarrel of the sons of Israel, because they tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? We get a little more information in this verse to qualify what this testing the Lord is about. It's this questioning. Is God helping us or is he not? Is God with us or is he not? God had already answered that question. If they believed God, there's no need for that question. But they were starting to doubt. the faithfulness of God. And that is called a test. That's testing the character of God. Just like our tests test our character, the tests against God tested. By the way, one of the first major tests that's recorded in the scriptures about God is in Noah's day, when there was only evil in the heart of men continually. And it repented God that he had made man. Here's the test. What's he going to do? Is he just going to pour out his wrath on mankind? Or is he going to extend mercy? What did he end up doing? Grace and mercy through Noah. Noah found favor in the eyes of God. He extended grace and mercy to Noah and his family, because they were righteous in their time. And so here's the test of God's character being played out before us. The majority of all people were just evil. And a lot of people, humans, in that situation, if we have power to do something about it, would just lash out against them. Well, God could have lashed out against all man, just destroyed it all, and said, I'm done with them. That was a failed experiment. But that's not what he did. He looked for a way to preserve his creation. Why? Because he loves me. He made us in his image. He loves us. He found a way to preserve us. That's what he's doing here through Abraham and his descendants as well. Finding a way to preserve us. And they're failing their end of this test. Let's see, anything I want to talk about in particularly? Anybody have any questions in particular about this before I move on? I will tell you, pay close attention to verse 7. It doesn't seem like an important verse, but it is an important verse. And again, if time allows, we'll talk about it toward the end of our class. So then the next block in chapter 17 is about the Amalekites. You can see on the map up there, north of the Red Sea, above the Sinai Peninsula, that area that says Amalek. That is the land where those people lived. They're about to encounter the Amalekites. And this is the story about that. Then Amalek came and fought against Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, choose men for us and go out to fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. And Joshua did as Moses told him, and he fought against Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. So it came about when Moses held his hand up that Israel prevailed. And when he let his hand down, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy. That's just a natural thing, by the way. Lactic acid builds up in your muscles, and holding up nothing becomes impossible. His hands got tired. But if he put his hands down, what happened? They started losing. By the way, that statement in the end of verse 11, that when he did this, this happened, and when he did that, that happened, I infer from that as his hands would get tired, he put them down, then they would start losing, he'd raise them up, realize, wait a minute, okay, they're winning now. So he's trying now at this point to keep his hands up. But they got heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him. And he sat on it. So they first brought him a stool to sit on. And that gives you a little relief for a while, but that really doesn't help your arms a whole lot. So it says Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and one on the other. Thus his hands were steady until the sun set. So Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, write this in a book as a memorial, and recite it to Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and named it, "The Lord is my banner." And he said, "The Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war against Amalek from generation to generation." What's the general message that we learn, just in general, from this story? Who won this battle? Okay, God. That's a good answer. It's a really good. It's almost always a good answer, by the way. God won this battle. Joshua led the armies, right? So Joshua was the victor. I mean, to put this in modern terms, the football team goes out on the field and the football team wins, and who gets all the credit? The quarterback. Quarterback gets all the credit because he's the one running the show. People don't know this on baseball. Usually the pitcher gets all the credit, but it really shouldn't be the pitcher. It's really the catcher. The catcher's the one that's running the show. But that's what we do. The guy who's leading the charge and the captain of the team, that's the one that gets credit for the win. But could Joshua have won without Moses standing on the mountain with his hands raised? Well, could Moses have successfully kept his hand up till the end of the day so they could prevail, except it be for Aaron and Hur? And the answer is no. So who gets credit for this from a human standpoint? It's a team effort. That's part of the message. It took all of the parts. Isn't that repeated in the New Testament? Where would the body be if all were an eye? Could we hear if all we had was an eye? Or if we only had an ear, where would the sight be? Or the taste or speech? Or what part of the body is unimportant? And the answer is, well, no part of the body is unimportant. We want all of the body. And the illustration that's being given there is that that's the reality of the church as well. It takes all of us doing our part. It wasn't Aaron's job to lead the armies. It wasn't Joshua's job to be the rank and file soldier. It wasn't Moses' job to do what Aaron or Joshua did. But with all of them doing their part, God saw that they were successful, and that is exactly what's taught about the church. When each individual member does its part, God gives the increase. So there's the general lesson from this. Is there anything else that we can take about if we dig a little bit deeper into this chapter and analyze? And let's take the whole chapter so you can draw from the first half or the second half, either one. Any themes? Okay, God is always there. I think that's very good. The idea of trusting God, having confidence that God is with you. Yes, ma'am.
Studies that we had say the water from his side on the cross is similar to this chapter about water on the rock.
There's a shadow, and we'll talk about that a little bit, maybe when we get to the connections between the New Testament and the Old Testament here. What about testing and providence? Are those themes of this section? Israel's testing of God and his continued provision to them, despite that fact. You notice how God's not petty? He's very long-suffering. We can be much more petty than that. We might very easily have gone, well, you know what, I have some water, but I ain't giving it to you because I'm tired of you complaining. Parents of children, you've never just got tired of your children asking for something and said, no, you can't have it. I was going to give it to you, but no. Yeah, and all the parents are kind of giggling and nodding their heads because they've all done it. God doesn't do that. He went ahead and provided for them anyway. Massa and Meribah, those incidents reveal these people lacked faith. They didn't have faith in God. They didn't have faith in Moses. Who had chosen Moses? God. How was he chosen? A burning bush that didn't consume. They'd heard that story by now. And then he shows up in Egypt, and what does he do? There's 10 signs given to him. First there's 2 signs, at least 2. I may be forgetting the third one, but I think there's 2. There's 2 signs before the signs even start. The first one is casting his staff on the ground. It turns into a snake, and he picks it back up. It turns back into a staff. And then he puts his hand into his cloak, pulls it out. It's covered in leprosy. Puts it back in, and it's clean again. That's the first signs that really ought to make somebody stand up and take notice and say, well, wait a minute. He's claiming to be sent here by God. Maybe he is. But then he acts in the 10 plagues, which are progressively greater. And then, when he raises his staff over the Red Sea, the waters part and they walk through on dry ground. And so it's not like they didn't have reason to believe that his claim was legitimate. God has borne witness that he's with him. That was the whole point of all of those signs in Egypt, was so that everyone knew that God was with him. And yet they still grumble against Moses, to the point that Moses is afraid that they're going to kill him. Leadership and intercession is another, I think, analysis that's worth putting in here. Moses, chosen as the leader of these people by God, how does Moses handle these situations? This isn't the first one he handles this way. This is yet another one where when he is confronted with a problem, Moses turns to God and says, what would you have me do? That should be a lesson for our dependence upon God. At whatever level of leadership that we may have, as husbands with our wives, we should depend upon God and his instructions. As parents with our children, we should do the same. Yes, sir, Mr. John. Yep, I promise I'll get there for the end of the class. I'll make a promise on that one. I'll make that happen before I get through. Let's talk about the moral of divine judgment and memory, which kind of touches on that question. The decree against the Amalekites reflects God's judgment. Will God judge a people? Yes. Does that mean he doesn't love man? No. He tells him, write this in a book for a memorial. So does God want the Israelites to forget this? Absolutely not. He wants them to remember it. He wants them to learn from it. He actually goes on to say, recite it to Joshua. So write it down as a memorial and then recite that to Joshua to bring it to his recall. What does he want to be forgotten? The Amalekites. I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. In other words, God is going to judge them, and it's going to be an utter judgment. There's no limit to that judgment. What did he do in Noah's day? What happened to the people who weren't righteous in Moses' day? Get it out in a minute. In Noah's day. Moses is stuck in my head. In Noah's day, what happened to all the other people? Give me the name of somebody besides Noah who lived right before the flood. I would agree with that statement. I think Methuselah died in the flood, more than likely. The math works right if you look at his age. Any other names? Anyone else? What were the names of the cities? We have one name because it was written down as a memorial for us. Babel. What about the rest of the world? What did they do? Nothing would be impossible for them, God said. Do you think that mankind wasn't accomplishing things? I mean, they just built this great city. But what do we know about any of the accomplishments of man besides that one city? See, what he did was he did what? He removed them from the face of the earth. He wiped them all out. And then from Noah and his sons and their wives, he populated the earth. You see where I'm going with this? What happens when God judges man? There's a lesson in that. And the memory of the acts of God are to remind us of God. So we've got Noah's flood, we've got Sodom and Gomorrah, we've got the Amalekites, we've got Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, we've got the Assyrians before them, we've got all of these examples recorded for us of God's judgment. Where are any of those nations, by the way? Any of those great? Where's Israel today? I'm going to tell you that group that populates Israel might be descended partially from the original Israelites. I'm not going to argue that point, but that nation, not the same nation. They don't have a high priest. They can't identify who's a Levite and who's not a Levite. They can't practice any of their religion. There's no atonement sacrifice. There's no high priest. There's no temple. None of that stuff. And they can't identify who belongs to where. Why not? Because of God's judgment. That is the way God's judgment works. Write this down and recite it. My judgment against the Amalekites is going to be complete. And we need to learn the lessons from the judgments of God. We've already talked a little bit about the similarities to chapter 16, so I will not do that. I'll just tell you, they almost follow the exact same pattern. It's just one's about food and the other's about water. the same kind of complaining, and they're almost verse to verse parallels. If it's verse 2 in chapter 16, it's probably verse 2 or verse 3 in chapter 17 that's talking about the idea. Their response to leadership, the nature of their complaints, the accusation against that we're going to die. Always, by the way, there's a whole lesson in that I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on, but that's the way people are. When we talk about things, it's always catastrophic. You cannot turn on the news without hearing it every single day. Whatever's happening is the worst that has ever been. It's never been this bad before. We've never had this happen before. This is going to end democracy. And it just goes on and on and on and on. They did the same thing. We're going to starve. We're going to die of thirst. Actually, I'll give them a little bit of a leeway on the dying of thirst thing. That can happen a whole lot quicker than starving to death. They'd have had to go a pretty good time without food to starve. The divine provision that it came is parallel, and that they doubted it is parallel. The testing and grumbling is parallel. And so we see that, in other words, they're not learning from the things that they're experiencing. And the lesson for us is we need to keep our eyes open and learn from life. And that's part of what that lesson on trials and tests on Sunday evening was about. Sunday morning. On Sunday morning, that's what it was about. So we learned. That's exactly what the purpose of the Old Testament is. Now, let's talk about some New Testament connections, and this is where we're going to get into some of the questions that have been raised. Exodus 17:6, where God instructs Moses to strike the rock. 1 Corinthians 10:1 through 4. We spent some time in that recently. I may even use that at the end of the hour as well. I haven't decided yet. I may not. But anyway, as the invitation. But there Paul refers to the rock that supplied water, and then he spiritualizes it. He talks about essentially saying that this was a shadow and the substance is Christ. And that's where that statement ends. And the rock was Christ. And so striking the rock brought forth their salvation. So did striking the Christ bring forth our salvation. And so there's this parallel in the shadow substance thing that's going on in that story. Testing in faith. I told you we'd get back to this. Massa and Meribah in verse 7. Chapter 4 in verse 7 in the book of Matthew during his temptation. What did Jesus say? Again, it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. This is where we learn what it means to put the Lord of God to the test. When God says he's going to do something, that's what Satan's temptation is. Throw yourself off the temple, because he said he would send his angels to protect you, lest you cast your foot against a stone. You don't test him. You trust him. Hebrews chapter 3, verses 7 through 9. This is the other passage that I might refer to at the invitation. The writer of Hebrews exhorts believers to avoid hardening their hearts as the Israelites did in Massa and Meribah. Don't make the mistake that they made. Remain faithful to God's promises. Continue to trust God. So there is a connection there. Moses' hands are supported by Aaron and Hur, allowing Joshua to prevail against the Amalekites in verses 12 and 13. In Hebrews 7 in verse 25, Jesus is described as that intercessor, which is kind of what that whole imagery is supposed to be. Consequently, he's able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. And so there's another shadow substance comparison of Moses to the Christ. Now, to get to John's question in the couple of minutes that we have left, probably actually don't have any time, I'm probably out. But verses 14 through 16, God declares he's going to continue to have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Ephesians 6:12, Paul speaks of the Christian life as a spiritual battle. We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. The struggle that is being set up here against Amalek can be seen as foreshadowing that spiritual battle that God was going to fight against our adversary, the devil. Why was God going to do this? I don't know, but why did he record it? So we could see how God works. And what God was going to do for Israel physically, take their enemy Amalek out of the picture, he's going to do for us spiritually by taking our enemy, our adversary Satan, out of the picture. And he's going to do it without stopping. I got to stop. Lord willing, chapter 18 next week.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory.